really improbable. If you had told anybody in 1963 and 1964, the best of folk and rock are going to merge, and they're going to form this style called folk rock that's going to have a bigger influence than the folk revival and a more intellectual social dimension than anything that has happened in rock music before, almost everyone would have said, you're crazy.
Welcome to the Better Each Day podcast radio show with Bruce Hilliard. Today and every day, reaching out for innovative ideas in every way. Today's show is brought to you by your future. It comes with a lifetime guarantee.
All right, my favorite topic. From Newport, Rhode Island to San Francisco, from pre-60s folk music as it morphed into the 60s. Author Richie Unterberger defines folk rock at its best. I hadn't finished his book, Jingle Jangle Morning, at the time of this interview, but I did live through the era, and I listened to these songs like the fanatic I was. Songs like Blowin' in the Wind, Abraham Martin and John, Clear to Sweet Judy Blue Eyes. He talks about society and artists and their interaction that defined an era.
Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me. I'm not sleepy and there is no place I'm going to. Hey, Mr.
That's a lyric from Mr. Tambourine Man. And the ebook is actually a combination of two print books that went by different names. The first volume was called Turn, 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 and the second volume, 8 Miles High.
And those
taken together, they told the story of 1960s folk rock.
Before we get too further, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, Richie?
Yeah, I am primarily a freelance writer, and I have been for 20 years. And I've written about a dozen books. Most of them are on rock music history. Besides the Jingle Jangle Morning book, which covers 1960s folk rock, I've also written books on the unreleased Beatles music and film, their rare material, books on the Velvet Underground, on The Who in the early 1970s. I have done coffee table books, the text for coffee table books on Bob Marley and Fleetwood Mac. And I've written about overlooked groups and solo artists in my book, Unknown Legends of Rock and Roll and Urban Spacemen. Those are the majority of the books that I've done. I think those are the most significant.
Beautiful. And I will feature those on my website in show notes. You live in San Francisco?
Yes.
You start out way back with the Newport Folk Festival, back when Dylan went
that
electric.
serves as an introduction of the most notorious incident of folk and rock combining in the mid-1960s. But after that introductory chapter, the coverage of the book starts with the folk revival of the late 1950s and early 1960s. Now, I want to emphasize, because some people see folk rock in the title and they think it's a book about folk music, about Peter, Paul, and Mary, and Dave Van Ronk and people like that. They are covered in the very early chapters, but this is a book about a form of electric rock music. And most of these books cover when folk and rock combined in the mid to late 1960s with groups like the Byrds, the Lovin' Spoonful, the Mamas and the Papas, solo artists like Bob Dylan and Donovan, other groups like Buffalo Springfield and Love, on to the late 1960s when you have Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, Fairport Convention in England, some folk rock groups who went psychedelic, especially here in San Francisco, like Jefferson Airplane. and singer-songwriters like Joni Mitchell and Leonard Cohen.
So it appears you've interviewed a lot of people who of note. Drop some names for me.
There's a whole list on my website, but I'll give you some of the most famous names of the more than 100 people whom I interviewed. Roger McGuinn and Chris Hillman of the Byrds. Bob Johnston, Bob Dylan's producer, Donovan, Judy Collins, Dion, who actually did some good early folk rock records around the time that Dylan did his first folk rock records, and Jack Holtzman, who ran Elektra Records, who signed a lot of the early folk rock artists, and Richie Furay of Buffalo Springfield. But although it's great to have some of those high-profile figures, I also interviewed quite a few musicians who aren't so well known, who made important contributions, and also people behind the scenes who were important, who have really interesting memories from that time, like record label owners, but also producers and session musicians, journalists, sometimes people who were just in the audience, and fans. And the print editions of the book came out 15 years ago. So the great deal of these interviews that you see used in the ebook version happened in the early 2000s, although when I've had the occasion to do some interviews since then, I've used some additional material in the ebooks. For instance, I was not able to interview Dion for the print books, but I was able to interview him 6 months ago, and some quotes from him are in the book, including his memories of Abraham, Martin, and John, which was his big folk rock hit in 1968.
Roger McGuinn, what I read about him in there is he's talking about the influence of the Beatles in the backbeat, and he brought in the Rickenbacker 12-string guitar, and it's extremely notable sound, I guess, of the Byrds. But that was my first experience with folk going electric, not even knowing what I was listening to, which brings me to the next thing, but which is genres. That's tough to write a book with mutating genres, if you will. How do you go about doing that without, stepping over the line or creating your own?
Well, luckily, folk rock was popularized as a term pretty quickly in the middle of 1965 when the Byrds had the first big folk rock hit with Mr. Tambourine Man. Even though the term was really coined by the industry, as far as I could tell, the first prominent use was in Billboard magazine, the leading music trade magazine. It was very quickly used to refer to all of those artists that I have just mentioned. And I think all of them fit that very well to varying degrees. When I interviewed Roger McGuinn, he even said, that wasn't the term that we would have, come up with on our own, but it was fairly accurate. We took a lot of our experiences as folk musicians, and we took a lot of rock, especially from the Beatles when they became very big in 1964. And the way I would view it, even if some musicians would say, I'm not folk rock, are musicians who draw some of the best elements from folk and rock as it existed in the 1960s. And they combined those ingredients to come up with a music that folk music on its own and rock music on its own could have never gotten to. I really loved the first decade of rock music, but it didn't have the lyrical sophistication and the musical experimentation that characterized the best folk rock. And folk music, even though with the folk revival it was reaching a peak of popularity, did not have the power and the muscle, but also even the melodic invention and the textural richness of rock music, especially when the Beatles emerged with the British invasion to introduce a whole explosive range of possibilities to rock music. And I wouldn't take the position of folk rock was the best style of rock music. I think it was one of the best styles, but it was extremely important in developing the form of rock to a more sophisticated, poetic form of art, I think.
The Doors got pigeonholed into as a rock band, but gosh, were they what, beat poet or poetry or jazz, or what were they? You know, that's an example of what do you call it? You know.
Yeah, and I should say I'm a really big Doors fan, and they're not covered in the book because they combined really interesting elements, rock, but also blues, some jazz, some classical music, and also a sense of bohemian poetry and beat literature in the lyrics. They were really the first example in the United States, I think, of a major act using more interesting lyrics than the romantic conventions of rock's first decade, who did not draw a lot from folk music. They knew about artists like Dylan and like artists like Dylan, and they knew about the form of country blues, acoustic blues, but they were not among the foremost elements in their mix. And I'm not saying that as a criticism, it's just not something that they were drawing from really prominently.
Yeah, I threw that as an example of pigeonholing a band to say they're of this ilk, they're of this genre or whatever. But yeah, I totally understand what you're saying.
I would call them psychedelic.
Psychedelic?
A psychedelic group, especially in their early days.
The Killer Awoke at Dawn. This book went through just a bunch of names, and this is what I found interesting. I haven't finished it. There's no way. It's a huge work, and wow, I tip my hat. But it was like a bunch of names, and you helped connect the dots for me, and that was really fascinating to see who worked with who and whatnot. So going into 65 and beyond, what would you say were the most important bands?
And the most important by far, I think, were the Byrds, because they were the first group to use the approach of electrifying, well, I should say basically taking the best of the Beatles and Bob Dylan. None of the 5 original Byrds were folk stars like Dylan already was by 1963 and 1964, but they were very experienced as folk performers, except maybe the drummer, Michael Clark. And at first they just wanted to be the Beatles. Everybody loved the Beatles. You know, maybe some of your parents didn't, but tens of millions of people in the United States loved the Beatles. And a lot of young musicians who grew up with rock and roll but had been playing folk music for the last 5 years when they got tired of rock wanted to get back into electric music, but this time not just as listeners and fans, but as performers. But even if the initial impulse was to be like the Beatles, as you hear on the Byrds' first recordings before Mr. Tambourine Man, there was a lot of folk already in their blood from their professional experience, and they brought a lot of their mastery of acoustic instruments and their folk harmonies and their lyrical consciousness with them. But after the Byrds hit with Mr. Tambourine Man, then of course Turn, Turn, Turn was also a huge hit of theirs. Very quickly in the second half of 1965, other groups followed. I think the most important of those were the Lovin' Spoonful and the Mamas and the Papas. And they're not a group, a duo, Simon and Garfunkel. Then in 1966 in California, Buffalo Springfield, and a group that is not as well known, but I think they were very good, Love. They were primarily known in Los Angeles, where they were from. Later in the 1960s, the early Jefferson Airplane, Country Joe and the Fish, I think were very important combiners of folk rock and then onto psychedelic music in the San Francisco Bay Area, and in England, Fairport Convention and the Pentangle at the end of the 1960s. And of course, coming back here, veterans of Buffalo Springfield and the Byrds formed the nucleus of folk rock supergroup, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and then when they added Neil Young for their second album, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. I cover a lot of other artists, a lot of other groups in the book, but I think that's the cream of the crop, people I just cited.
Do you cover Woodstock at all?
Yeah, I know it's a long book, and I realize you're not at the end yet, but the last chapter is about festivals, and especially how folk rock was, I think, instrumental in changing how music was presented, especially at festivals. At the Newport Folk Festival in 1965, I mean, it's not a secret even to people who don't know much about folk rock, Bob Dylan caused an enormous amount of controversy by playing electric rock music at this folk festival, even though he'd already started to do that on records. And there's still controversy about the crowd's reaction, but at least some people booed, some people cheered. It was a mixture. And there was some indignation on the part of some serious folk fans about whether it was appropriate to even play rock music, especially if you had been a folk musician. By the end of the 1960s, just 4 years later, this was largely a non-existent issue. I think in live performance, both the festivals but also the audiences were much more open-minded and tolerant of mixing music, whether you had folk and rock on the same bill, but also if you had some folk rock acts and some hard rock acts and some soul acts on the same bill. As long as it was good, people were like, well, let's just have everything. And the same attitude spilled over to the performers. Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, for instance. Within the same performance, you might see some hard rock like Down by the River, and you might also have a wholly acoustic performance of a song like Sweet Judy Blue Eyes. On some songs, you might just have Stephen Stills playing acoustically alone, or Neil Young playing acoustically alone. On other things, like Neil Young's Southern Man, you'd have this long, almost hard rock jam, electric jam. And it wasn't an issue like, should they be playing acoustic? Should they be playing folk? Should they be playing folk rock? Should they be playing electric at all? Audience wanted to hear everything, and the musicians wanted to have that freedom to explore everything, no matter whether it was low volume or folky, or brought in some Indian music or reggae music. Everything was available, and I think that really was a plus and remains a plus in experiencing music. That's still a big part of folk rock's legacy more than 50 years later. We have a big free festival here called Hardly Strictly Bluegrass, in Golden Gate Park. It started as a bluegrass festival 15 years ago or a little more, but very quickly it became something where you could hear almost anything. It's more folk music than most festivals, but it has rock, it has even some jazz and world music and funk. And I think audiences really appreciate that. And if you don't like one of those musics, well, you just don't have to go to it, but you don't take the attitude as some folk purists were back in 1965, that it's an outrage and that it's a commercial sellout to be playing electric rock music. You can play anything now.
It seems that's always the case. Some of my favorite songs ever came out of that era, and I hear young people that say, oh, yeah, I'm familiar with that because my parents played it.
I hope it conveys how much enormous change happened in 5 years and how on many layers I believe it was fascinating. You had this combination of styles which was really improbable. If you had told anybody in 1963 and 1964 the best of folk and rock are going to merge and they're going to form this style called folk rock that's going to have a bigger influence than the folk revival and a more intellectual social dimension than anything that has happened in rock music before, almost everyone would have said, you're crazy. Because the folk audience kind of hates rock and roll, and the rock audience hardly even knows about folk music, and they don't care. And it's proof among, many styles that I could examine, but it's proof that you can't predict popular culture, and you can't plan these things. You couldn't plan the British invasion either. That's a different issue, kind of. Really improbable. If you had told anybody in 1963 and 1964 the best of folk and rock are going to merge and they're going to form this style called folk rock that's going to have a bigger influence than the folk revival and a more intellectual, social dimension than anything that has happened in rock music before, almost everyone would have said, you're crazy. Music can really not just reflect social changes that happen in a very short period of time and very unexpected positive ones, but can also help enact those social changes by creating this kind of canvas where performers can develop in ways that are their audiences and that they themselves don't expect, and also that the audience doesn't expect at all, and the performers and the audience grow together. And, you know, it would be glib of me to say, oh, and so that could happen right now, you know, in these dire times that we're living. All we got to do is kind of think hard and create this stuff, and it'll happen. You just can't do that. But it does give you hope that things like this can happen, not just in music, but in artistic endeavors and in life itself. And I also think, you know, even though that initial explosion of folk and rock, when Bob Dylan and the Byrds, they were the most important artists in bringing these styles together, it's really interesting to me how it didn't stop there. It wasn't like we've got this great style of music, now we'll just keep with this formula and keep doing this for the rest of our careers. They very quickly, the best folk rock artists, moved on to bring in psychedelic elements, Indian music, free jazz, experimentation with electronics, much longer songs, concept albums, confessional singer-songwriting, all this other stuff. And I don't see that as like a departure from the initial impulse of folk rock or even the folk revival. I see that as a natural continuation. A lot of these young musicians, before they went into rock, they were attracted to the folk revival because there was such an eclectic range of material that you could play and learn. You could hear British Isles folk music, Appalachian folk, country blues, French Canadian music, Mexican mariachi music, all this.
Calypso. You mentioned calypso in there, and I forgot entirely about the Harry Belafonte.
That wasn't a huge influence, but sure, you could also draw on calypso.
Yeah.
So they were already combining all these styles of music within the folk revival. Combining folk and rock was a radical step, even more radical than what they were doing in the folk revival. But because they were so hungry to explore things in both music and their lifestyles, they didn't stop there. And they kept bringing in all this other stuff. The Byrds did it very quickly with 8 Miles High. At first, people were like, yeah, they have a great sound, but they're getting most of their attention by electrifying Bob Dylan and Pete Seeger songs. That could have been their formula. They kept doing that sometimes, but then they brought in the psychedelic stuff on their own material, like 8 Miles High, to create a totally new music that wasn't blatantly influenced by Bob Dylan. Jefferson Airplane and the major San Francisco groups also went in psychedelic directions, and this was happening all throughout the initial burst of folk rock musicians. The ones who really endured even past the 1960s kept doing that. I'll just give you like 3 examples. Neil Young, who has always flitted back and forth between acoustic and electric rock music, and sometimes has gone into country, less successfully, I think, into electronic music and things like that, but he's never stays still. Paul Simon incorporated reggae and gospel music into his records when he went solo, and then, of course, in the 1980s, he used South African music on Graceland. And Joni Mitchell, I think nobody would have predicted that she would have gone into jazz music in the last part of the 1970s, but she did that. It wasn't the most commercially rewarding part of her career, but artistically it's something she really wanted to do. So that hunger for new experience, I think, is something that folk rock was pivotal in popularizing within not just rock music, but music everywhere.
ice cream castles in the air and feathered canyons everywhere. I've looked at clouds that way, but now they only block the sun. They rain and snow on everyone. So many things I would have done, but clouds got in my way. I've looked at clouds from both sides now, from up and down, and still somehow it's clouds' illusions I recall. I really don't know clouds at all.
There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop. Children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
Support for Better Each Day comes from BruceHilliardHomes.com. For a better day in buying or selling a home, search BruceHilliardHomes.com or visit our website Better Each Day for more information. And while you're there, subscribe to the show. It's free. That's BruceHilliardHomes.com, Windermere Real Estate, and make it better each day.
You've been listening to the Better Each Day podcast radio show with Bruce Hilliard. We'll be back with a new horizon, but until then, honor the future. It comes with a lifetime guarantee.
And we're all just trying to make the next day a bit better.